When Andy and I were at Leeds University, we were both really immersed in the visual arts and in film, and also loved music. We used to go along to almost anything that went on in the in and around Leeds, and it was a real centre of the sort of touring world. And I think that we hadn't really thought of starting a band up just initially, but we went together to New York in 1976. We both got different research grants. I had a research grant to look at Jasper Johns, and Andy had a research grant to study Gothic architecture in northern France. So obviously New York was the place to do that. And on the back of this ill-gotten money, stayed with a friend of ours called Mary Harron, who years later did I Shot Andy Warhol and Betty Blue and American Psycho. But at that time she was a struggling journalist on New York Punk magazine. And we used to go for quite a while down to CBGB's, which was just around the block from her apartment in Greenwich Village. And I think that definitely, from my perspective, sort of triggered off the thought that there was something interesting happening in music. And when we came back, punk rock, British punk rock had started, which was a kind of version of what was going on in New York, which I think we both found rather exciting, but at the same time predictable, and musically predictable. And I guess that sort of triggered off the idea of saying, well, there's got to be more to this, more.
Yeah, I mean, I think
around it.
Yeah, I mean, when we were at the same school before university, we were at the same school, and we played around then. We had a band then called Bourgeois Brothers, and we liked the idea of playing around with music, and just some of it was just to entertain ourselves, kind of things that made us laugh and stuff. And in '75, I think we'd spend an afternoon sort of playing chess, drinking gin and strumming a guitar, and again making up things which either amused us or we thought were interesting. We were very impressed with the live performances of Dr. Feelgood, and we thought that we loved the way they were very quick and short and contained these little jewels of ideas, and we liked the way they confronted the audience, and they didn't pretend to be natural. They embraced the artificiality of it, and those things were quite exciting to us. And then, as John said, we went to New York and met a lot of people like they were in that band, Television, or people that played with Patti Smith and stuff, and they were very friendly with us, and I think that sort of encouraged us to sort of go down that road a bit further. And punk rock we almost felt like we'd gone through the punk rock stage when punk rock had happened. You know, it's like.
Yeah. That's exactly, entertainment. That was much later, but you never appeared to have been a punk rock band, even though you started in 1977. Where a lot of second generation punk bands also started. Yeah. But that's exactly what my next question. So did you feel as well that you were post punk even when you started out with your band?
Absolutely, I think so. Yeah. And I think when the sort of the British punk thing, like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, I think it kind of reaffirmed the idea that anybody could do it. I mean, I thought, and also that. There weren't. You didn't have to follow those rather tedious lyrical ideas that were around in the 70s. That you could sort of go anywhere. You could go anywhere you liked with it.
And I think that when we had the good fortune, I think, of living and working as musicians in what was then a very deprived and ignored regional city in England, Leeds. It was totally not noticed in terms of the music business. In fact, our good fortune was to be able to play for 2 years without anyone seeing us reviewing any concerts. Because I think when you start off writing music, naturally you play genre music to start with. You know, you might play the dominant, subdominant, tonic chord progressions because you know where you're going, and we were able to work our way through the elements of genre to the elements that we decided we were really excited by, and that took a bit of time to do that, and it was write something.
You mean that some of the songs, the music wasn't as adventurous as it became
as
later?
It became, yeah. I mean, because I think when we first started, entertaining ourselves, some of the first things were
a bit pastiche.
Yeah. And then you start saying to yourself, what is this really all about? And watching the punk rock acts, of course, what was wonderful about it was the attitude, but actually the music was incredibly conservative. I mean, the Sex Pistols music was no different to Black Sabbath's. I mean, it is just pretty straightforward, faster rock music, and the opportunities to do something different were seemed to us so exciting. And when, I think for myself, when you see things that were so interesting in film terms, I mean, for example, Godard's movies, Numéro 2 was something that we both used to watch. I'd seen quite a few times, and that notion that you'd have something going on which was described real life, but not necessarily the real life of the dominant cliched view of real life, and then a commentary that happens within itself about itself, was a very stimulating idea. And so I think one of the early songs, like Anthrax, was kind of like
the split screen thing.
It's kind of like number 2. In I think in our minds when we wrote it, how could you write a song like Godard would make a film, which was interesting, and I think that's why it sounds like a gang of, even if you can't understand any of the things quite that Andrew is saying at the same time that I'm saying something, you get the notion that here's something where you're not probably meant to hear everything really clearly, because it's 2 completely different points of view about possibly even 2 different subjects, because that's kind of like life is like.
Exactly, it's a version of real life.
Yeah.
I think once you start being serious about these things that you're working on, and you actually want to invest them with some credibility and some proper thought and stuff, you become open to a lot of different ideas. I mean, John was talking about Godard, but I think everything becomes a source of, once you start writing songs, you start thinking seriously about them, everything becomes a source of inspiration to what you're doing. It might be reading Joseph Conrad, or a bit of Baudelaire or something, or it might be ideas that come to you when you're walking around the supermarket or something, or advertising slogans are always a rich source of inspiration, and always have been. I think a lot of John's lyrics, have kind of have the quality of a advertising slogan, in that way that it kind of sort of catchy and catches in your mind, and and the double entendres and all that.
So you said before that one of the basic tasks was to eliminate elements that were not necessary, or not, you didn't say it like that, but I think that's basically what it comes down to. What were the elements then in the end that when you started to work as Gang of Four were crucial, and how would you sort of describe your approach as a band then?
Well, I think first of all we wanted to eliminate cliche, and it's quite a challenge really, because we're all used to speaking in a form of code to each other, and because we know what the subtext of the conversations are, and but the choice of words or the choice of sounds means all sorts of things. I mean, for example, when we were recording Entertainment, we genuinely and seriously argued and discussed how much reverb we should use. I mean, it seems like an improbable and very, very arcane conversation to have. But if you're trying to make something that sounds authentic, how much does adding all of these effects on make something sound inauthentic? And I think that the most disappointing thing about a lot of mass entertainment is the fact that it all sounds kind of like everything else. And so if you want something to sound like itself, you have to create a new vocabulary, and that's very demanding. So you have to go down into all of the constituent parts. So if you are genuinely trying to eliminate cliche, you start thinking about, well, what is the purpose of a bridge between a verse and a chorus? Or what is the purpose of using this subject or another subject? And clearly there are a limited range of subjects that were considered to be acceptable. I mean, we were, two of our singles were banned precisely because the subject that we chose was outside the range of permissible subjects. And so when we set about trying to write stuff, we said first, really, it had to have an authenticity about it that we would endlessly test. And I think sometimes Andy and I, tested things to destruction, and sometimes it was tested to a point where we felt, oh, it makes sense in its own rules. So that was quite often it's a theatrical thing. So you set up a scenario and then you say this is what's going to happen. And I'm not really talking here about whether it's music or lyrics. I mean, I think the two were so interwoven that it was impossible to say, I don't know, At Home is a Tourist was about that lyric any more than it was about Andy's approach on the guitar.
Okay. In what way do you think it was the result of what you tried to achieve, or you achieved in the end, also connected to the spirit of that particular time? I mean, to understand both lyrically and also, I mean, the whole attitude of people with each other, that I think that's really well reflected in your music, the sort of, I don't know, the harshness and it was kind of brutal as well, so, and that's from what I hear, because I'm too small to have experienced it firsthand, but also how people were at that time with each other, to a certain way, because everything had to sort of be negotiated again. I mean, like your lyrics about, sort of relationships and stuff, nothing was taken for granted anymore. Was that right? Was that...
That's a good way of putting it. Nothing was taken for granted anymore. That's a good way of saying it. I mean, Leeds was a very harsh place. I mean, and it did sometimes feel kind of brutal. That it was obviously that time in the 80s was very polarised in an extreme way politically between right and left, and you had to you were obliged to pretty much take some kind of position on that spectrum. But we were there was quite a lot of physical confrontation between the National Front, the extreme right wing, and the British movement, similarly extreme right wing, and they would come on. They knew where people like us went to drink, and the pubs that we went to. They knew, and they would sometimes come to the pubs and attack people and smash things up, or sometimes they'd come onto the university and find people, and there'd be pitched battles, people throwing rocks at each other, and so it was it was very polarised, and it was quite brutal, and it did feel almost like ground zero. And I think your suggestion that nothing was taken for granted is quite accurate. We were sort of looking around ourselves and our friends and other people and the world that we lived in and the stuff that we watched in TV and read, and these ideas of received ideas and were things that we felt you couldn't remain unchallenged, and that we had to challenge these ideas that seemed to be just accepted or thought of as being natural or so on. We wanted to challenge those things. and to describe what our lives were like in relation to that.
I think.
Do you think the music reflected that as well? This sort of.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But it was. I mean, like Home as a Tourist is a good example. Musically, we liked, John and I liked disco music. We really liked it, and of course that was true punks would be disgusted by the concept of disco music. You know, it was fuck disco, and it was really a horrible kind of concept. But we embraced it and we loved it, and so Home as a Tourist is a kind of, it's our kind of cartoon signifier for disco. I mean, it's not really like disco at all, but it's kind of just got this fall on the floor thing with a kind of rolling bass line that's sort of like disco. And then it's got this guitar, which is not remotely anything to do with disco, which is sort of landed from another planet. And it's a kind of a discourse between these clashing genres, and then within that, this character is describing his alienation, again in a sort of rather cartoon fashion, and setting it within the commerce of a potential sexual exchange set in a disco. You know, so. It was, I mean, there's jokes in there, but they're kind of serious jokes. You know.
It's a very complex way, you know. I mean, lots of bands were, I mean, not quite as complex as you probably, but trying to go really more complex ways. Did you think about the commerciality of it all at the time? Of your songs, and of the way how complex, you know, everything was, both musically, lyrically, sort of. I mean, it's quite a lot to take, you know, for...
Yeah, I think that the number one thing for us was to follow our instincts in talking about these things, and in following our instincts in terms of what we were doing with the actual music and the instruments, but we consciously did not want to. I mean, Going Forward's music sometimes isn't very obvious and isn't instant, and sometimes, but we didn't want to be avant-garde. We didn't want to be. We thought of a lot of sort of avant-garde music as a bit unlistenable, and also we having come from a sort of art background, we wanted to do something which didn't involve having to, you know, you didn't have to have a degree in it to understand it. It was something which hopefully related to pop music on enough levels that people would get it, and people did get it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and we spent a lot of time arguing about words, you know, and I think we would. Sometimes, I mean, there were certain words that were banned words. I mean, I wouldn't like to use corny words, so you'd sort of write up the word. Can't reuse the word dollar, for example. You know, dollar's a bad word to use.
Although we did to begin with, yeah. And then we thought we don't want to copy ourselves. We don't want to make cliches about what we've already done. So once we'd done an EP called Another Day, Another Dollar.
Dollar was banned.
Let's not use the word dollar anymore. You know,
it also was like a cheap shot. Because it's easy to be anti-American, and it's lazy, because of course it would assume that you've got the other, the bad guys in our system, and we're the good guys. Of course, it's not the case at all. You know, we're all deeply woven into this thing, and that at the core of some of these things, which you said were complicated, was this very difficult sense of yourself as being a collaborator in what was going on, and I think probably why we're playing here today is that discomfort that you feel as a human being in this consumerist society where, you know, people are massively rewarded like the Sun Kings of the world if you're really successful, and the rest get nothing. But then in the middle there are all the collaborators who make it possible. We make convenient negotiations or convenient accommodations with it, and that notion is very strong now. I mean, it's expressed a lot in, say, the anti-GA or anti-consumerist type thing, which of course I would naturally feel is part of my consciousness. But in the middle of it all is that sense of, yeah, but I still like having a TV set, and so that those sort of uncomfortable ideas in the middle, and if you can make it funny or interesting, like Andy said, we did not want to be avant-garde. I mean, some of the things I think are I think Anthrax is pretty avant-garde.
Pretty left field.
Yeah, pretty left field. But we weren't setting out to on that kind of agenda. It's actually meant to be theatrically and viscerally gets you. You know, you're meant to actually dance to that. In fact, Anthrax is a great danceable track, despite the wall of noise and the nods and winks to concept art and all that kind of stuff.
That brings me to the next question, because for a band with your ideas, even expressed now, I found it really surprising that after the first EP you signed with EMI. Why did you decide to do that at the time? That was the time when, people like Geoff Travis and Daniel Miller, I think it was a bit later when they started, but around that time when all these things happened with independent labels, and wasn't the DIY attitude something that was more interesting?
Well, we knew we were expected to do that. I mean, we knew that was the road that we were supposed to go down, was to sign to Rough Trade. Geoff Travis was very much around then, and we genuinely thought that it was more interesting if we were on a label. We were talking about this a bit earlier. If you were on a label where you were there, being presented sort of side by side with Kate Bush and Cliff Richard and Wire and all these the kind of the full gamut of what was available in sort of British early 80s entertainment, music. And it's very tied in with this point that we've never felt of ourselves that we're right and other people are wrong. We've never felt that kind of finger pointing and saying us guys on who are in some sense on the left, we're better than you people who are embrace capitalism, and we felt that's a false polarity, and because on many levels life is much more complicated than that, and also we collaborate in many ways, and signing with EMI seemed to be a good.
There was also another side to it. We had a very unfortunate experience with our indie label that we did produce the first EP on, because Fast Records was the EP with Damaged Goods and Anthrax on it, which first came out, was done in that way on an indie, and we never got paid. And in fact, I would say the overwhelming majority of indie labels were run by sharp entrepreneurial individuals. Stiff Records gets set up by a sharp entrepreneurial businessman. Mute Records, it was a money-making machine. So there were some, I'm not going to use honourable people like Geoff Travis was someone out there, or Tony Wilson. So
Daniel Miller.
Or actually Daniel Miller. I'm not saying this, but I just mean that the primary motivation for those indie labels being set up, except for the real knock it out yourself, was small businessmen. They were small businessmen as opposed to large businessmen. So there wasn't, it seemed to me at the time, a hard and fast ideological difference between this do-it-yourself ethic. Remember, we weren't a punk band. Do-it-yourself was something which was kind of interesting, and there's various reasons to do it yourself. One is you're an outsider, and having always been an outsider band, it made what we did much more entertaining to be with EMI, and they were remarkable actually. They just left us alone. I mean,
the whole idea that
it was incredible.
Indies gave you artistic freedom, and the majors would control everything you do. It's actually the other way around, because EMI, they never had anything to say about the music that we did, and they never had anything to say about the artwork. We just gave them the artwork, said here it is, and print that up, and here's the music, and they're okay, right, we'll do that. And whereas as a record producer, I work with lots of independents all the time, and they come down and they want to have their say in what's going on in the studio, and how's this music going, and you're changing something. They say, no, Andy, don't change that. I like it the way they actually get involved in creative decisions.
Okay. But then the famous Top of the Pops event where you were asked to change the lyrics and refused. And I read in this Simon Reynolds book that you yourself said later that probably killed your career, and that also took away the support you had with EMI before. Is that Right. Can you tell me that story from from today's point of view? Like how crucial was it for your, or is that all exaggerated? I don't know.
Well, no.
I don't know. I think it probably is exaggerated.
It is, yeah.
At the end of the day, Top of the Pops is just a show.
But at that time, though,
it was very important at that time.
It would have gone top 10 almost certainly.
It would have definitely been,
been
top 10, top 5, whatever.
We were in the end of the 1970s. There was a very strange rule that went on. Top of the Pops was the most powerful music programme by a mile on British TV, and because British music was at that time very dominant, if you had a hit in the UK, you had a hit in Europe, and quite a good shot of a hit in North America as well, because it was seen as the kind of laboratory of change. And alongside that, you had this incredible dominance before commercial radio picked up of the BBC radio station. So if you were not played on BBC radio, more or less you didn't have any chance of anyone buying these things. And to the huge surprise of almost everybody, us included, Tourist, which is not a commercial track, entered the top 30. And the rules that they had was that any track that went into the top 30 had to go on Top of the Pops if it was going up the charts. So this was a great source of panic. And when they listened to the lyric, there's the lyric which is "the rubbers you hide." And rubbers is an American English term, not a British English term. When we put the lyrics together, actually, I didn't think anyone would know that rubbers meant condoms, because we didn't use the word condoms either then, really. They said you've got to change it, and you had to re-record your music to go on Top of the Pops. It was a musicians' union thing, so you didn't actually mime to the track, the song you'd actually recorded. You mimed to a track that you'd re-recorded. It was like a kind of Russian doll of stupidity. And so when we re-recorded the track, we said, okay, well let's see if we can play the game. It's just for this program. It might, because we were still having no airplay. No one would then play the record, and no one still plays the record. So we did actually agree to compromise and change it to packets. So the packets you hide in the top left pocket. But when we went on the show to mime to the re-recording or the re-recorded version of the song, they suddenly realised what we were all about, because we weren't about family entertainment. And they said, you've got to go away and re-record it again. Of course, when you're in a recording studio...
They said they wanted us to put the word... They said, packets, that's not good enough. Change the word to rubbish.
Rubbish.
So that it sounds like rubbers, but it's not. But we said, well, rubbish would be meaningless, wouldn't it? Yes, but that's what we want you to do.
And we said, fuck off. And we walked off. And yes, it's true. We would have probably... The record would probably, on all the evidence... ended up as a top 20 or top 10 single, but on the other hand, we're musicians. We are not motivated. Of course, we want to make a living out of what we do, but our primary motivation was the art itself. And it was an example of censorship, which is was and is so widespread. In fact, there's probably more censorship now than there was 20, 30 years ago, because the acts censor themselves before they even get there. You just wouldn't have written a lyric like that if you wanted to have a commercial record, but you'd never written a song like Tourist in the first place. So I think it is exaggerated, but at the same time, as an act, the fact again that we can be here today playing this kind of thing is the result of us not compromising and agreeing and giving in to these censorship enterprises, and I think people respect that. I hope they do anyway. I don't know. What do you think? Do you respect it?
No.
No, it's rubbish. I don't respect it.
But you made that reference before, and that's one question that I can ask now while we are there. Is there a connection between like the times now and the times at the end of the 70s? You mentioned that you can feel it, that there is something, because more and more young people seem to sort of dig that old music from that, especially the post-punk era, and I was wondering whether that is more than just the usual cycle of, okay, that hasn't been around for a while, so let's check it out again. Is there a connection, and that's why the music is so adequate for today's time as well? Or
I think there's I think there's, I mean, that polarity I was talking about earlier doesn't really pertain anymore. People seem to be less politicised on one level, perhaps in the kind of the old-fashioned left-right sort of way. But people are more interested in challenging, not letting people get away with stuff as much as perhaps they did in the past.
One of the things that we talk about quite a lot, I mean, at the moment, is it's the general challenge to or the questioning of stuff is pretty widespread now. Everything's being tested, and that's really, I think, a function of the new media that's around. You know, is something right or wrong or indifferent or whatever, and people tend to now, club together and ask lots of questions as a group. You know, sort of crowdsourcing of things and the like. But there is a massive mega scenario that we're involved in. You've got the war in Iraq was a very good example where collectively what surprised me was that there was virtually no comment from the music industry about this. And I'm comparing this to when I was just a kid in the 1960s. Everyone from Kenny Rogers, Ruby Don't Take Your Love to Town, to the Supremes, to Edwin Starr, more or less everybody wrote a song about the Vietnam War. And it went through pop, country and western, whatever, and virtually nobody wrote anything at all to do with this. Not just in the UK, but in the United States and in Europe. That clearly there might have been a few kind of obscure episodes going on at the fringes, but the fact was there was a total absence of commentary about that. Either explicitly or subtly, in a way that I found quite surprising. When we wrote I Love a Man in Uniform, which came out during the Falklands War, that in turn was banned. But it surprised me that none of that has happened. And I think people now are a bit unhappy with the fact that the music that they've been consuming hasn't really been taking on all this stuff. And we see people taking righteous anger into the streets against G8 or G20 and globalisation. You see that, and you totally resonates with me, and you understand why they're doing that, and probably the frustration is, where's the art that's actually like that? And you can see why they might want to look at art that maybe took that kind of thing on.
Because I think people ultimately want something that's authentic.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you can have a certain amount of escapism, you can have a certain amount of just a good tune or just a good dance, but sometimes you want something that's ultimately authentic. I mean, something that we've noticed is a lot of bands have kind of either copied or been inspired by the sound of Gang of Four, the way we put beats together, the way we put the drums and bass together, and the guitar sound especially, and very few people have kind of taken the lyrical thing on further, which is an interesting sign of the times.
At the time, we decided, well, with the suits, I mean, I think we all wanted to look faintly corporate. In fact, some of the photographs we did with Anton Corbijn at the beginning was us, wearing a double-breasted suit and pretending to smoke £20 notes, and it was a kind of, I think, because we were ex-art students, I always sort of thought we often make it a gag. This song is like Jackson Pollock, or this song's like whoever. But I think some of the approaches to what we look like, I thought were a bit like those sort of post-World War I drawings by, I'm being incredibly pretentious, by George Grosz, those kind of things. You fat capitalists standing around smoking money, and it was a kind of gag. And also, it just said it was placing a distance away from punk, because I know now the phrase post-punk has been invented, which more or less is a catch-all thing, means stuff that happened after punk rock. But we were not a punk band, and I think that stylistically made that point, but it was really more of the cartoon thing. Do you think? Wearing a great big, badly fitting sort of D-mob suit was one way of doing it. Although I thought David Byrne, when he sort of copied the idea, did it much better. But it's always.
We had a few arguments at the time with Hugo, the drummer, because he adopted a kind of skinhead sort of. He kind of looked a bit like a skinhead. We would sort of argue with him, like, why? What is this thing? And he basically told us to fuck off. So that was the end of that conversation. So.
But you know, Kraftwerk, played brilliantly with trying to look ordinary or look serious or look like, and it was that
look corporate.
Or look corporate, and I think that was really the rationale for it. Yeah.
They are like that, though. I met Ralph Hütter once, and I was surprised how much he really actually lives up to that image. Well, whatever. Okay. So my last question is, and then I have to ask two for the colleagues as well. Is with the so-called post-punk era now, it's been so diverse. Like I mentioned to you, all the bands I've talked to, and there were lots of others as well. Was there anything that united these bands, though? I mean, was there any aspect that one could say, okay, even though the Specials and us and Wire and Duff and Neubauten and all these bands were really, really different musically and from what they thought, but something was there that, I don't know.
I think so.
What would
Yeah,
that be?
yeah. Well, I don't know, but Neubauten were. I remember thinking that because we did that, Army's got this. It's just a piece of metal banging another piece of metal, and I kind of thought that they, in some way, had kind of taken on that idea with it, but much more. The whole industrial thing with chainsaws and all that sort of stuff. And you kind of spotted things that you had in common with other bands, and DAF. I think we felt there was something in common with them.
Yeah, I think it was. I
don't know. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. I don't know.
There's a sort of collage. The only thing I could think that unified is a collage approach. That people said, I like that and I like that, and let's throw it into a blender and see what comes out of it. I think that's the only thing I can really see unifies so many various acts. I mean, I would probably think the Specials I'd put to one side because they were a genre act. They said we're going to make music that sounds like ska, but when you look at Wire, who were definitely saying this is this, or Green in Scritty would be like reading Gramsci. So I like reading Gramsci. I like listening to Aretha Franklin, and I like electronic dance music. So let's throw them in the blender. So the only thing I can think of is collage.
How did you like the Sinti bands, like, the Human League, Depeche Mode, Ultravox, Soft Cell, Gary Newman? What was your way of looking at that? Did any of these bands make an impact on you?
Give me that list again.
Well, it's a very diverse. It's
Yeah.
Human League, but the Mark II, that's Depeche Mode, Ultravox, Soft Cell, Gary Newman.
I think they kind of left us pretty much unmoved in any way at all, really. I do rather like some of the later period Depeche Mode, but if you're talking about when they were a synthy band, it didn't really do much for us, I don't think.
I mean, I think that
definitely not Ultravox.
If they had written brilliant pop, like say ABBA, who at that time were writing the most sensational pop songs, I thought what they did, they were writing pop songs but using synthesizers. If they had written a song as good, anything like as good as Knowing Me, Knowing You, then I would have thought a lot more of them. But it wasn't great pop. It wasn't pop like Walk On By.
But Human League, I mean, I love that their first single, Being Boiled, was wonderful, fantastic. Because his droning voice and the simplicity, the space of it is lovely. And then it all kind of went. They were hugely successful, and it wasn't that interesting. But I liked that kind of American one they did at the end. The one with
Giorgio Moroder.
I'm Only Human. That one's great pop song.
Yeah.
I think that album was pretty good. And that was done with Thingy Jam and Lewis and what do they call those?
Def Jam.
No,
Record.
Terry Lewis.
Terry Lewis and sowieso,
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Those two producers did it.
Jen Jackson.
So he knows you judge it
Yeah.
rather than the synthesizers. Is are they good songs?
Yeah.
And really like that. That's a good example of a good song. But there's always been good songs, and is that doesn't necessarily make it a good, in inverted commas, movement.
So the new romantic scene, Let's Club, and all this sort of weird makeup people, did that do anything for you? Do you have any
Steve
connections?
Strange.
Steve Strange. it's I mean it's great when people have a lot of fun and look stupid. You know, I mean it was just. I mean that is the point. The point really of going out and being young and having fun is to piss people off, and they did that brilliantly well. But I mean the music's pretty kind of. Again, if there was a great pop song hidden in there, great pop songs are always worth listening to, you know. And but the great music at the time was not being made in that world. It's Black American music, you know, where the whole of dance music was being reinvented. That was what was really interesting. You know, Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel were really inventing it, and Africa Bambaataa at that time, that was where the real, in my view, where the real action was compared to rather ho-hum, you know, fashion pop, you know. But it must have been it was a lot of fun, you know.
What changed for bands when MTV started in 1981? I mean, that probably helped all these bands like Duran Duran sort of become really famous, didn't it? So was that important? Did that change the whole face of pop music because it shifted really from the content more to...
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in an extraordinarily visual culture, and what things look like now have an incredible primacy over what they mean, and sometimes the notion that what you look at means something, it seems a bit odd to people. So I think the impact of the MTV stuff was you had to have something that was a look, and then I think to the great disadvantage of some really good music was the music was then over-explained, or it was explained too much, you know. And I think I don't know what lame video idea would have been created for a song like At Home Is a Tourist, but you can imagine some American film director saying, okay, he's coming in point of view, guy comes in, looks around, surprised, and suddenly expresses regret, horror. You can imagine the sheer banal idiocy of it all.
Or the big guy in a deck chair with a hanky on his head in his front room.
Yeah, it'd be full of unusual and surreal images, or it would be, or the other one is just look wacky, you know, so that it all became about what things looked like rather than what they meant, and that's quite unfortunate because music is what things sound like. It's not necessarily what things look like, and it's very unfortunate to lock an image to it. And I hate it when I see a Firestone car advert and it's got Venus in Furs by Velvet Underground in it, because it ruins the song for me forever. It ruins the song absolutely forever to have that. Eric Satie, I love the music of Eric Satie, and you see it used in sentimental ways, but it's not sentimental music. It really is spiky and quirky and nutty. And
you have to split those things off so they don't. I mean, it's like. People talk about Impressionist painting as chocolate boxy because some Impressionist paintings have been used on chocolate boxes.
Exactly, yeah.
But you just have to
push it away.
Push that away.
Yeah.
You said yourself that you, of course, as a musician, you also have to live. But were the 80s really the era where the labels started to think more about commerce than caring about the artists they had, signed?
Labels have always thought strictly about commerce. They don't care about you. You know, they just think about making money. That's all they're thinking about, and it's fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it's like Tesco's or Sainsbury's supermarket or whatever. They think about making money. You know.
So there was no change in the 80s in that respect.
No, I mean, record companies frequently have not been very bright about the way they do things, and they're quite slow to change, and they've missed so many opportunities as the digital age kind of came into play. Blah blah blah. Demographic, long tail, etc.
Yeah, I don't.
It's an in-joke, so.
It's an in-joke, but I mean, I don't think there is any change in the way that that record companies as businesses have approached the business of selling music, and they've always been in the business of maximising their profits at their suppliers' expense, you know. And I think it hasn't changed. I mean, I think that some of the most appalling offences against musicians took place in the 50s and 60s. If you had the good luck stroke bad luck of being a songwriter for Elvis Presley, you know, good luck, he's going to sell 5 million singles of Love Me Tender. Bad luck, you've got to give away 50% of your publishing for it to happen, you know.
At least.
Or whatever, or 90% or something. So there's always been that side to it, you know, and I think that it's a diversion for musicians to say it's about the industry. It's a diversion for musicians to worry about music distribution and stuff. I mean, what we both are pretty passionate about is that musicians must be paid for what they do. I don't believe at all that it is right that people should, you know, on a massive scale, not expect to pay for music, because again, this festival, and we played yesterday at the Great Escape Festival in Brighton. Those musicians who play there, have to make a living, and if no one pays for stuff, how are they expected to live? And I think that's something that, you know, really enrages me, you know, that people don't allow musicians to have the right to make a living by just giving stuff away for nothing.
Okay, I think that's basically it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah.
That's good.
Vielen
Thank you.
Dank, meine Herren.
Yeah.